Hi everyone, I'm making this video to talk more about growth in tech careers. Salaries in tech, especially in India, are very diverse. Just on entry level alone, you have companies that pay like 2 lakhs per annum, and at the same time, you have companies that pay like 40 lakhs, even in a bad market. So, a gap of 20x. And this gap only becomes wider and wider with more experience, especially if you're not growing in your role. And what's the then way to move up in this ladder and bridge this gap? The only way to do that is by building the right skills and capabilities. Hi, I'm Anshuman Singh, and I'm making this video to deep dive into what it takes for you to grow in your career. I also then want to take you through the Scalar curriculum to talk more about how the curriculum actually bridges the gap that I'm talking about. I believe the Scalar curriculum is one of the most comprehensive curriculum for your path, but then I'll also show you that. Assuming that you are a senior front end or a full stack developer who is very front end inclined, if that is not the case, then please look at the description of this video. There are other videos with respect to different personas. Please look at who you are, what's that link. Please click on that link and go to that link. If you stay back, then I'm going to assume that you are a senior front end or full stack developer. Now, question is, why am I making this video? I'm making this video because I want to talk about what does the growth path and the curriculum for that growth path look like for somebody who is senior front end or full stack developer. Assuming that your goal is that you will want to become an SD2 or SD3, or even let's say an architect of front end full stack roles at product MNCs and startups. Now, I think given you're senior, I'm not in a position to tell you why people fail or why you would fail. I would rather talk about, hey, look, here is what the interview looks like, here is what is expected of work, and I would try to take as many examples as I can so that you can self evaluate where you stand today. If at all you do see gaps, then how do you fill those gaps, what you should learn, we will cover that in the curriculum section, which I'll discuss later. So I'm going to discuss the interview structure and the work structure. Let's start with the interview structure first. um, for some reason, a common misconception among people is that DSA is not important. However, even for a front end, or let's say a full stack role which is front end heavy, DSA seems to be important. There, I mean, in a lot of top product companies, there's going to be at least 1 to 2 DSA rounds. Now, good thing is none of them are going to ask you hard questions. They're going to be easy questions or medium easy questions. Um, Cover all topics. I mean, so you can probably also get questions from dynamic programming. However, like in a lot of companies, even let's say dynamic programming is not asked on these roles. Now you might ask, hey, but like why DSA is important? In fact, to be honest, like if you look at things that you might implement even at work, they use DSA under the hood, and hence their understanding is important, right? For example, you might be asked to implement um, spell checker. Spell checker, if you even if you have a dictionary, spell checker is based on DSA. If you were to implement your own spell checker, right? If you were to implement an autocomplete function, where if I type something, you tell me suggestions, that is DSA. Um, if you were to tell me, hey, here are two files, show me difference between these two files, the GitHub style, also DSA. If you tell me, hey, look, I mean, here is a listing item, I want to sort them or I want to like see them in a particular order, also DSA. I want to remove a particular item, also DSA. Here is a set of sections, I want to arrange them in in the form of a tile so that they still fit in the same page, also DSA. I have a source and a destination, I want to find the shortest path between them, like almost like a Google Maps, also DSA. So a bunch of problems are DSA problems, and hence, I mean, even front end and full stack developers are supposed to know DSA. And in fact, these are the problems that I just named. These are the kind of problems you can also expect in interviews where somebody expects you to implement these things. Then the second kind of round that happens is tech rounds, where in fact, like going deeper into your understanding of JavaScript, the engine, the front end engine, CSS, and maybe certain back end stuff as well is important. I'll again go maybe a little more specific on that. For example, when it comes to JavaScript, um, let's say how does the runtime environment work in JavaScript, right? Which is what is the execution process, what is the call stack, what is the event loop, callback queue. Is JavaScript multi-threaded, single-threaded? If it is single-threaded, then like what is the role of the runtime environment in JavaScript? Or for example, how would you do, let's say, a detailed polyfill for the map function in JavaScript? Or for example, if you had to minimize the JavaScript bundle size, then how would you do that? um, if you had to optimize a website performance, then how do you do that, right? And like essentially, how do you check like if the corresponding server, let's say, supports some form of encryption or compression, stuff like that, right? Like if you have to do, let's say, do some form of in-browser caching, then how do you do that? Some of those aspects around JavaScript. Like for example, if I ask you to implement a library yourself, how would you, are you comfortable doing that? That's the depth of JavaScript. Very similarly, CSS, if I ask you to draw different shapes, are you able to do so or not? Questions might be around, if you have prior experience with React or Angular, you might get questions around those two. On the backend side, again, like imagine, I mean, you could be using Java or Node.js. Depending on which one you're using, you'll get grilled more on those, right? For example, in Java, you might be asked questions around collections, generics, lambda. On Node.js, you might get further questions around the event loop, and then like how does Node.js work? If is it again single-threaded, multi-threaded? If so, like how do you increase the throughput of Node.js server, etc. Then comes the design rounds, and design round becomes extremely important as you become more and more senior. So, for example, at your level, you should expect that you will have HLD rounds, which is architectural design rounds, where you might not be expected to know about, let's say, what is multi-master, or I mean, let's say, what is the internal architecture of a database like Cassandra. However, what is expected of you is you do have an understanding of what is a SQL database, no SQL database. Why should you choose one over the other? What is basic sharding? How do you design schema? How do you design APIs? um, those are again basic expectation of you, and if you don't have that, I mean, then no matter how good of a front end developer you are, typically on senior hiring you might get rejected. There are questions on previous work, which is what is the kind of work you've done in the past, what are the most complex projects you've handled in the past. If I change the requirement, then how would you go about designing that, right? Just taking a very basic example, let's say you say that you built a blogging website. Now on that blogging website, if I suddenly want to add a feature where there could be multiple authors and they are editing the same article at the same time, they're collaborating on it, how would you go about building that, for example, right? How do you do conflict resolution there? What kind of API would you build there? That becomes an extension of your work, for example. um, or I mean, scenario based design questions. For example, if I ask you to design a Google calendar, then how do you design APIs for Google calendar? If I ask you to design same Google Doc, right, then like multiple people editing at the same time, how is that handled visually? How are the APIs designed? How is conflict resolved? If you ask me to, let's say, build Google Sheet, then how am I handling repaints, etc., to make sure that the Google Sheet is doesn't become very laggy but still works smoothly? So which basically involves deeper understanding of how is a page rendered, how is DOM created, um, what is slow on the browser versus what is fast on the browser, right? So how do you optimize browser performance? um, in general, a good understanding of web architecture, which means if I say, hey, what happens when you type google.com and press enter, then basically what is DNS, how is information transferred? Very good understanding of difference between um, WebSocket versus polling versus a regular HTTP request. In some cases, you might have a machine coding round, which means you might be given a, a case, for example, let's say I book my show, and you might be asked to build a very quick prototype. Again, there, what kind of schema have you designed? What kind of API have you designed? How have you structured your code? That becomes important. And then you might have a behavioral round where culture fit, how have you worked with previous teams, how do you work with product teams, etc., etc. Those might be evaluated. So that's for your interview success. Then you have work. On the work front, everything that is there in the interview, that is important. However, one of the most key skill which you might have already realized is how do you learn new tech from reading documentation. How do you work with large code bases? um, because your frameworks are going to change today. I mean, there might be React, Angular, there might be Next.js later on, Vue.js later on, there might be some other JS later on, so who knows. um, Few other table stake items. You should be good at optimizing site performance whenever required. You know what are the steps, what are the things that could be done. You have deeper understanding of CDNs, um, resource packaging, resource compression. You can mentor junior folks in the team. You know, or you care about maintainability and extendability of the code, right? So for example, at your current company, if there are things that you know can be reused, you're building the right practicing practices around reuse, building the right libraries, framework, etc. You're able to collaborate with the product team, and this is a very very important aspect. If you're in front end, then you're able to collaborate with product team on the product vision. You're able to help them or maybe work with them on ambiguous problem statements. So if you have a goal that we have to increase the number of users by X, or we have to, let's say, increase the daily active users by Y, or we have to increase the time spent on the website by some other number, then how do you go and solve it? It doesn't have a real answer. I mean, you have to break it down into small parts. What makes somebody spend time? How can we do more of that? So that basically is something that would help you succeed at work, grow at work even more. You might ask, oh fine, now I understand, like, hey look, I mean, here are the things that are important. Now how do I get started on that learning journey? For that, I will now walk you through the scalar curriculum, which and show you how that maps to all of what I have just discussed. Scalar curriculum has multiple tracks, including backend track, full stack track, and data engineering track. However, given your background, I would recommend sticking to the full stack track. And there I will talk about the modules, what or how they help with the interviews, how they help with the jobs, and in a way, if you complete the module, then what are you able to do after this module? The first module, no surprise, is DSA. Now, if imagine I'm making the assumption that all of you already know how to code, even though it is in JavaScript, you know how to code. In case you don't, then like for beginners, there is a 2 month module before this which teaches them how to code in basic Java. But I mean, if you unless you don't know how to code, you don't shouldn't start with beginners. You should start from here, right? So DSA. Now DSA is very exhaustive, has all the topics. Has I mean, the way it is delivered is that you have live lectures, and post that every day you get assignments. Um, and assignments are basically helping you practice and build that habit of coding. One good outcome of that is if you code regularly, in a way, over a period of time, your coding accuracy increases. In a way, you make less and less bugs, which directly correlates to productivity, because if you make less bugs, you get more code done faster, you build more features faster. So it actually correlates to work productivity. Not to mean, I mean, like when it comes to interview, obviously like this is very very important for the interview. Typically you'll have 1 to 3 rounds on DSA and problem solving. All topics are covered here. If you've covered this is going to be fairly exhaustive. On jobs, as I said, coding accuracy. In a way, once you do this, then like thinking about things efficiently, that becomes almost a given. And it becomes easier for you to understand how other systems work, because a lot of those systems, they use DSA internally. In a way, if you have done this DSA, then some of the problems I mentioned, right, which is, let's say, how would you design your own autocomplete, how would you design your own spell checker if there were no libraries, um, or how do you go about, let's say, sorting in a particular fashion, etc. All of those become extremely easy functions for you. um, so post DSA, which is 4 to 5 months, then you come to relational databases. Now this is again like, for a full stack developer, you might say I might also need to know NoSQL databases. Sure, it is later on covered in the HLD module, but let me just talk about the relational databases right now. Here, what is covered is everything around schema design, indexing, transactions, isolation levels, and then how to write SQL queries. Um, Now, in interviews, as a full stack developer or as a front end developer, you're going to be given questions around schema design, right? So this basically covers that. You might be asked to write SQL queries, again covered. You might get asked basic questions on transactions and indexing, also covered here. Um, in a way, if you build any full stack project, you would be required to use some database, and actually a relational DB is at the backbone of it. So at work, it will help you in all your full stack projects, especially like for the backend portions that you contribute to. Um, Once you're done with the relational DB, then the next step is where you start with the full stack track. Now, there the first part is where you learn in depth about HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So if you remember, like some of the deep JavaScript questions that I mentioned about, or deep CSS questions that I mentioned about in my earlier part, all of those are covered here as well. And they're covered in some structure. And I mean, they're just not covered in theory, but like you get to also implement through assignments. And assignments, you might be asked to implement a JavaScript feature, or here is a front end, maybe change the interaction somehow, or maybe draw a shape using CSS. All of those is given as part of assignments, which is then automatically evaluated through our judge. Um, so that's your HTML, CSS, JavaScript in depth part, which covers for interview your JavaScript questions, CSS questions, tech round questions, and web architecture, a small part of web architecture questions. In jobs, to be honest, I mean, if JavaScript is the basis of everything, so if you don't understand JavaScript in depth, you're going to struggle at job. So hence, very, very critical for module for jobs as well. The next module, but before I move to the next module, it is possible some of you might already know these things in depth, or maybe you know 90% of this stuff. One of the other things I want to call out is that if in all of these modules, if you feel that you already know 80-90% stuff, post May of 15th of 2024, if you reach a module within Scalar, then you can skip that module and in return get the notes and the assignments for that module. You can move on with the next module. If later on you realize that you want to redo this module, you can redo it as well. So the modularizations will be supported at Scalar, and hence you'll be able to attempt these modules in by skipping it, as long as you are fulfilling the prerequisites for the next modules. So hence, if you already know 90% of this, you can skip this module, and you'll get notes in return. You can solve the assignments asynchronously, and you can take the mock interviews or contest asynchronously as well. All right, moving on. So the module after that is again the full stack part 2, where you learn more about React, DOM, and machine coding with low level design. This is this is where, I mean, you actually start building some small projects, which is your machine coding rounds. But in a way, like some of the things that I mentioned, like for example, type ahead, or network optimizations. How does internet work? How does React work? And then maybe starting to build now things on React. All of that is covered in this module. So in your interviews, all questions that are around React, all questions which involve a machine coding round or some form of assignment, um, all questions around web architecture, I mean, actually, portion of web architecture, website optimizations, design case studies, they get covered in this module. Again, very important for work as well. In a way, if you have done this module, then you'll have good hold on React.js. You would have good hold on understanding how does the entire request flow across, and hence what are the steps involved to optimize websites. um, how does a browser work and the browser architecture, how does web work and web architecture. Those things you'll get better on, and you'll get better on making machine coding rounds as well. One other thing to keep in mind is that even in this module you have assignments, however, are of different kind. You might have assignments where you might have to add a feature or build small things, and then maybe through unit test cases we check whether you build the feature correctly or not. Or there are these other kind of assignments where you might have to build a component, and then again we check whether the component is working as expected or not. And there might be some MCQs as well. In fact, like you can assume that almost in every module, every class has some or the other form of assignments. Okay, then moving on, post that there is a full stack capstone project module. This is where you build your project. First, you learn about a backend. Now, one of the things we do is here we've chosen the Node.js and MongoDB as the backend, which is the MERN stack. However, you could also choose to have Java as the backend in case, let's say, you want to become a Java full stack developer. So that's another option where you can maybe, since you might have done maybe earlier modules in Java. So if you have done earlier modules in Java, maybe you could choose Java as the backend. Given you already know JavaScript, so hence we've kept it comfortable, Node.js and the MERN stack. And this is where you again like start to build a project and like learn a bunch of things in the process. So you learn about Node.js, MongoDB, MVC architecture, certain design patterns as well. So factory design pattern, for example. How do you validate data? How do you authenticate? How do you design APIs? All of that, along with WebSockets, testing and security, all of that is covered in the full stack capstone project. Here, the capstone project is, let's say, building something like a book my show end to end, or something like an IMDb end to end. That is an example project, but you build it over a period of 1.5 months. Now, why is this important? Firstly, it helps with your resume because there is a project built there. You shouldn't stop here. You should also go and build more things once you have done this. But it gives you a start. It gives you one decent project on your resume. Two is it helps with all API design questions, schema design questions. While schema design has already happened in SQL module as well, and whatever was remaining in the web architecture. So things around authentication, security, testing, all of those are also covered in this module. You also, by the way, learn to integrate external APIs and payment gateway, for example, through this module. Now, everything done in this module is probably the closest to work. So, hence, doing this module helps immensely with work as well. Once you have done that, then there is system design module. System design is where you now start to also learn how things scale in the backend and in the web architecture. So when you're building something very large scale, then how does that work? First, the building blocks: caching, CDNs, master slave, multi-master, SQL, NoSQL, etc., etc. And then a bunch of case studies like search type ahead, messages, Elasticsearch, let's say something like a Zomato or a Swiggy or a Google Map, Uber, Hotstar. Those we cover in the form of case studies. So if you have a system design round, this is more than comprehensive. Most probably you will not even get these kind of questions. You might be expected to know lesser system design, but like there is no harm in knowing more of system design. This, by the way, also is helpful because at work, if you are good at this, then it becomes easier to have conversations with people who are senior in the back end. Um, in a way, it helps you spread across the entire full stack realm, have design discussions, becomes easier for you to move up the ladder as well. If you have done this, now then there are a couple of electives. One is around product management for engineers, which is what I would recommend that you should do given your background. There is one more which is around data engineering. Now this is, to be honest, very optional, might not be needed for you for the kind of work you would do. But product management for engineers, which is a 1 month elective, which is something I would recommend because it will help you understand product metrics really well. It will help you understand how to set up measurements really well. It will help you also think through that if you're given an ambiguous goal of, let's say, a user metric, then how do you break it down and then how do you go towards that goal. Eventually helps you succeed in the role that you are in. I repeat once more, all of these modules have assignments, a bunch of which is actually self evaluated and are coding assignments. I mean, they're not necessarily MCQs. Some are MCQs. So by the time you're done with all of this, you'd also be fairly hands on, assuming you're attending the classes and solving the assignments as well. One more thing which I would add is, look, I mean, having the curriculum is one thing, but curriculum alone doesn't make sure that you actually end up learning. Content alone doesn't have a lot of value. It's basically the ecosystem that you learn in. One of the parameters that we have seen is that the completion rates at Scalar, if compared to, let's say, recorded courses, are roughly like 100 times better. And one of the reasons for that is that you're not learning alone. You basically have other peers with you who are very similar. So you basically are talking about assignments almost every day in a group. You have live classes, so there is a schedule that is enforced. um, After every class there is assignment, so in a way there is a habit that gets built over a period of time, that you attend classes, then you solve assignments, then you attend classes, then you solve assignments, and so forth. You have PAs that help you in case you get stuck solving a problem. You have one-on-one mentors that actually guide you in this journey, so you can talk to them, you can schedule calls with them. In fact, I would recommend that as you become more and more senior, paths basically diverge, so actually getting insights from your mentor, who might be actually more senior than you in your career, is is going to be extremely useful, and hence you should keep talking to your mentor as frequently as possible. um, and I mean, eventually the community, you develop friends, you develop peers who help you stay more consistent. Thankfully the platform also is very gamified, so if you like what you're learning, actually there are good chances that the platform will also become addictive, and hopefully you will develop a very large streak of problem solving, and then you get to post about that on LinkedIn. Anyway, so that's more or less about Scalar. I hope that helps in understanding what to learn, how to learn, and if you decide to join Scalar, then I'll see you there. Thank you.